morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told out of Voice of Radio, so with the Oceania International Championships happening this weekend, I thought it might be fun to have a little bit of a look, a primer, if you will, of Pokémon TCG decks that you need to be watching out for this weekend. That sounds like fun, and we might as well start off with what is the best deck in the format right now. It's Lugia V-Star. That is the deck that everybody is looking to beat. That is the deck that is expected to go and win. It's the best deck in the format. We just saw the regional championship over in Orlando, where 6 of the top 8 decks were Lugia. Lugia is, as it stands at the moment, an absolute monster. And the way the deck works, very simply for those of you that are unfamiliar, is that basically you've got Lugia V-Star with its ridiculous Summoning Star ability that lets you search for 2 colourless Pokemon that don't have a rule box from your discard pile and pop them straight onto the bench. And then, generally speaking, you're just going for Archeops here that lets you, once during your turn per Archeops, search your deck for up to 2 special energy cards and attach them to your Pokemon in any way you like. So yes, you absolutely can just power up your Lugia, hit for 220, job's a good un, and that is absolutely a play that is available to you. But what you can also do here is just run with a whole range of different attackers with different pros and cons. So you might see people, one common tech we see here is Yveltal. Because of course, Yveltal, it's a very expensive, very awkward attack cost, but it gets a straight one-hit KO on literally anything, which is wonderful. Now, you might be wondering about the attack cost here. Do remember, one of those special energy cards that you can search out using Archeops is your Aurora energy, which counts as any energy. So, yeah, you are definitely going to be wanting to go for that one. That is a very, very big deal. Also worth noting that one of the ones you can go for here is Powerful Colorless Energy, which is phenomenal because, of course, it means you do 20 more damage on your colorless Pokemon, like Lugia. And, of course, it also means you can go Double Turbo Energy, which is just 2 colorless energy, which a lot of people think is very good. Because with stuff like Lugia, it absolutely is. They're not the only ones we see. Raikou is often seen in this deck. Firstly, it does 120 to the active and 120 to a bench Pokemon, but it also hits weakness on Lugia, which is honestly kind of a big deal. And one which we've seen popping up in most decks nowadays, and it is a phenomenal card, Stoutland V, because Stoutland V, if you KO a basic Pokemon, means you get to take an extra prize, which is phenomenal. And you only do 40 damage, but remember how I just said you can accelerate a bunch of powerful colorless energy all at the same time? Yes, I did say that, because you can, and that will beef up Stoutland very nicely indeed. Another card which I personally dislike greatly, but one that you can use in Lugia is a Dunsparce. The one that came around in Fusion Strike, because that one actually takes away your weakness, which is ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely ridiculous. Removes weakness of colorless Pokemon. It's a bit dumb. So that's your presumptive best deck in the format, and there are ways around it, of course. Without Dunsparce, lightning attackers are pretty good. Obviously, Lugia does rely on an ability, so a cheeky path to the peak played at the right time can absolutely be something that a lot of players are looking for. But there's a reason this is winning so gosh darn much. Honestly, the biggest question going into Orlando is, are players going to be just playing Lugia? If you can't beat them, join them. Or are they going to be countering Lugia because they think that they, in fact, can beat it? But it's not the only viable deck out there. One deck which is seeing quite a lot of play at the moment, and we're seeing in a lot of tournaments, admittedly didn't fare so well in Orlando, but it's seeing a lot of play, is your Regigigas deck. And the Regigigas deck all just revolves around, shockingly enough, Regigigas, that's got the ability Ancient Wisdom, and if your bench consists of exactly Regirock, Regice, Registeel, Regieleki, and Regidrago, you can attach up to 3 energy cards in your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. And it's very important to realize that it is energy cards, not basic energy. So that means that you can... And again, it's things like Aurora Energy in this deck, again, comes in very, very handy because it means that you can use any of these attackers. And then, you know, Regigigas itself is really good against VMAX because it does 330, but that's about it. But then you got Registeel that can just do a flat 220, minus 50 for each colorless energy in your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost. It's not the best one around. But Regice does 100 and stops Pokemon V attacking. Regirock does 140 but hits for a really good weakness. Regidrago hits 240, less 20 for each damage counter on this Pokemon, so try not to get it damaged. And then, of course, you've got the other Regidrago, which lets you draw until you've got 4 cards in your hand if it's active. And then we've got 2 different Regieleki. One which does 120 to one of your opponent's bench, and one that does 120 plus 40 to 2 of your opponent's bench. And obviously, as I've said, these are hitting weakness on these Lightning Weak Pokemon like Lugia, which, as previously mentioned, is honestly kind of a big deal. And this all just adds up to a fairly ridiculous deck that is absolutely one of the decks to beat going into the format. It's not the only deck around, and like I say, it did have a fairly lackluster showing in Orlando. We didn't see any of them in top 16, for instance, but don't think this is a bad deck or it's disappeared or anything silly like that, because I can assure you it absolutely has not. Now, one of the other decks, which is very much the best deck in the format, probably after Lugia, I think that's probably fair to say. Oh, it really kind of flicks around, but Lost Box. The Lost Zone box deck is a phenomenal deck. And the reason it's called the Lost Zone box deck is it revolves around the Lost Zone. So obviously, playing around with Comfy here, that is your draw engine of choice. Let's look at the top 2 cards of your deck. One goes in your hand, one goes in the Lost Zone. But of course, this is brilliant because you want cards in your hand, because that's what you used to play, and you want cards in the Lost Zone to activate some of your cards, and this is good. We've also got Chorus's Experiment. Let's look at the top 5 cards of your deck. 3 go in your hand, 2 go in the Lost Zone. That's a good thing. And then when you get enough cards in the Lost Zone, Mirage Gate comes in. You need 7 in the Lost Zone. And you search your deck for up to 2 basic energy cards with different types and attach them to your Pokemon in any way you like. So very, very similar to the Lugia deck. You're just playing around with all kinds of different attackers. Again, the Amazing Rare Raikou is a really good option that a lot of people play. But we also play the Amazing Rare Rayquaza, which again is a great card. 3 basic energy, 1 grass, 1 lightning, 1 fighting. You discard all basic energy from this Pokemon, and you do 80 for each type of basic energy discarded in this way. And yes, most of these builds are playing like 6 different types of basic energy. They're not mucking about. This isn't like some occasional tech that's creeping into the deck. This is like a legit big part of the deck because... well, very similar to the Yveltal in the build we just looked at, this is just a really good way to get giant KOs on Pokemon that may otherwise be out of reach. And then there's Sableye. And the thing is, right, Sableye is one of those cards. I made a whole video a little while ago about how much I don't like Sableye. Sableye is just annoying. If you've got 10 or more cards in the Lost Zone, you can place 12 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way you like. If you get this going early enough, evolution decks will literally just fold because they cannot keep their pre-evolutions on the bench. But even against other Pokemon, this can be ridiculous. Oh, and I suppose don't forget Cramorant. 4 cards in the Lost Zone, which is super easy to do. And it's basically 110 for no damage. Against small Pokemon, and it's in the early game to get some damage on the board, this is a rather ridiculous card. So yeah, lot of tricks in this deck. It's called Lost Zone Box because it is a box deck. By that we mean there are lots of different things you can do with it, and this absolutely has a whole bunch. Incidentally, when I'm going through these decks, I'm not intending to give you, every tiny little bit of the deck. This is supposed to be an overview of the top decks. Now, another deck which has been around seemingly forever and going nowhere anytime soon, this is Mew. Mew actually won in Liverpool back on the 21st of January. It's like a month ago. This has won a regional championship of 761 players very, very recently. And Mew, I mean, Mew's a deck we've had for a while, yeah. Basically, the entire deck revolves around Genesect V using Fusion Strike system to draw until you've got as many cards in hand as you've got Fusion Strike Pokemon on the field. And generally speaking, all your Pokemon are going to be Fusion Strike. And then you've got Mew V Max, which will just allow you to copy any of your Fusion Strike Pokemon's attacks for 2 colorless energy. And yes, in this deck, there are other builds. There are some builds that go a bit different, but the main build we generally seeing playing success at the moment is this double turbo build that literally just plays for double turbo and no other energy. And you can copy Max Miracle, but you need to have a Mew V Max with the energy copying a second Mew V Max on the bench. And that does 130 and goes through anything. Or what we can actually do is copy the attack of Mew V, which is a weird one, but that totally works, whereby you get to shuffle it into the deck and deal 70 damage. Mostly it's about getting off the board. Obviously, you've got Genesect's attack, which is just 210. And you can't attack next turn, but Mew V Max has got free retreat, so you just free retreat between them and you're fine. And we actually see Aerodactyl V Star seeing a bunch of play at the moment. In this deck and a bunch of others. It has become a trendy tech in Mew, but it's a card we see actually popping up in more and more lists all over the place. And the reason for Aerodactyl V Star is because single energy, and until this Pokemon leaves play, it gains an ability that has the effect your opponent's Pokemon V in play, except Aerodactyl V Star, have no abilities. So it's a way of shutting down all these abilities I've shown you on, well, all these decks so far, really. They all get shut down. It's a weird one, but I'm seeing this popping up in more and more deck lists. You know, the highest placing Mew in Orlando actually played this. Grant Hayes went and got top 8 with a Mew deck that was playing Aerodactyl. So we're not talking about some tech which is, you know, popping into silly online lists. We're talking about like a legit tech which is getting up to the top tables. Now, the other big deck which I think is rounding out your main decks here, there is one I'm forgetting, we'll get there in a second, is your Palkia deck. People are loving it, Palkia. Now, nominally, it's basically built around Origin Form Palkia V-Star. 2 energy, 60 damage, plus 20 more for each bench Pokemon in play, yours and your opponent's. With 2 full benches, that is 260, which is kind of brilliant. And then you got the ability Star Portal, lets you attach free water energy from your discard pile to your water Pokemon in any way you like. It's obviously a V-Star Power, and V-Star Power are once per game, but it's basically like a one-shot deal to get you some extra energy out during the game. And your Radiant Pokemon of choice is going to be Radiant Greninja, which, it gets played in a bunch of decks, but this one can legit attack, because, you know, free energy, discard 2, and you do 90 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. That can get a double KO, which is kind of awesome. And then the thing that most decks play it for outside of water decks, which lets you discard an energy card from your hand, draw 2 cards. Good for early game draw. You are generally playing this with Articuno. That is the one from Silver Tempest. 2 energy, 70 damage, automatic paralysis. And this is really important against some matchups where you're basically whittling them down, getting automatic paralysis, and it does 50 to itself, but it's got 110 HP, so you can basically get 2 lots of automatic paralysis before it will KO itself. And that's kind of big, because basically it just gives you an option, which is huge. And yeah, sure, some decks are going to be able to get around it. That's inevitable. But if they can't, this will get you basically a free KO as you whittle them down and then finish them off before they've had a chance to get around it. And then we do see that played with, it's actually Ice Cube's kind of a nice trendy one. Free energy, 70 damage, and prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from basic Pokemon. But I showed you decks like Lugia and Lost Box, which are basically playing a whole bunch of different energy or ways to play different kinds of attackers. So you will see things like Ice Cube played in those decks, even though they're not necessarily staples. What is a staple in this deck, of course, is your Inteleon line. You've got your Drizzile with Shady Dealings, and then you've got your Inteleon with double Shady Dealings, lets you search for 2 trainer cards rather than 1. And then you got the Inteleon from Chilling Reign, which is making a comeback lately, that lets you drop 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon, which is kind of awesome. For a while there, we went completely away from this, and nobody was playing this one. We were just going Sword and Shield, searching out trainers. We've kind of gone back on that a little bit now. And don't get me wrong, the Sword and Shield one is absolutely still seeing play. But whereas the Chilling Reign one disappeared a little while ago, it very much seems to be back. Oh, and this deck, like so many others, you are going to be seeing playing Drapion. Drapion is just an absolutely unashamed Mew counter. Basically, if your opponent plays a Mew V Max, this is a basic Pokemon that will KO a Mew V Max for 0 energy. So, yeah, that is a pretty blatant counter. Now, the one that I've been forgetting up till now is a deck that took 2nd place at Liverpool Regionals, piloted by Stefan Ivanov. It's Goodra Lost Zone box. So it's got a lot of those Lost Zone things we would usually expect. You're playing comfy and all things like that. But the deck is really built around Hisui and Goodra V-Star. Because free energy, 200 damage, and you take 80 less next turn, which is a pretty big deal. And then it's got a V-Star power that just completely heals. But what this deck basically does is just try and never get KO'd. Like, your goal here is just do not get KO'd, like, ever. And slow down your opponent and frustrate them and have a jolly old good time doing it. I mean, you have a good time. Your opponent does not have such a good time, I'll be honest with you. But it's a deck that a lot of people weren't taking seriously. And now, actually, we've gotten to a situation where an awful lot more people are absolutely taking it seriously. And I suppose I should mention just briefly, because there's a billion decks out there I could mention, but the regional in San Diego at the beginning of January was actually won by Gibson Archer Tang playing Vikavolt. Now, Vikavolt plays a whole bunch of weird random stuff, but it plays Aerodactyl as an example, but it's largely built around Vikavolt V that is a lightning type attacker, which means hitting weakness on Palkia and on Lugia, and it stops your opponent playing item cards, which is frankly a pretty gosh darned big deal. This is a weird one in that, like I say, it literally won over in San Diego. It took down the San Diego Regional Championships, but if you start looking at results after San Diego, it's not really been showing up. Over in Liverpool, it just wasn't really on the radar. I mean, there was a 19th place finish as the top one. Over in Orlando, again, it didn't really show up at all. The best finish was 44th. So it did win a regional, but it's not really been showing up after that. Make no mistake about it, the Lost Zone box decks, Lugia and Mew, they are probably the big 3. You've then got Palkia decks, which are absolutely still around. And then you've got a bunch of other decks, some of which I mentioned here, some of which I haven't, because we've only got so much time. But they are really the decks you're looking out for. And as you're heading into the Oceania International Championships, I'm hoping you're now a little bit more prepared. And do make sure you watch the stream, because it is going to be awesome. For now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to know what you think about this. I want to know which of these decks you think is going to end up winning. I want to know which decks I haven't mentioned that I should be looking out for. So go nuts in the comment section, but be nice! And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at the Wasi. That's where we talk about Pokemon and a whole bunch of other card games. And please do consider checking out patreon.com/PTCG Radio, where you can support the channel, get some bonus podcasts, join a Discord and chat about, well, anything you want to, honestly, Pokemon or otherwise, and get shout-outs on the channel, like the lovely Landon Dastrup, who's been a supporter of this channel's pretty much since its inception, and is just I can confirm, an absolutely thoroughly lovely chap. But by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.